to recap what we discussed last week, what do you recall from our discussion in regard to Samson and his parents and so forth from last week?
But the angel of the Lord come down and talked to him, and told him they were going to be a Nazarite from birth.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Which meant what? That he's set apart for the purposes of God, right? Now, and we know that he was set apart by God, for God, and the Nazarite vow was something that a person could take upon themselves as if they were to seek to especially consecrate themselves to the Lord, to knowing him, to serving him, and so forth. But in Samson's case, it was declared before the fact. And to the extent that even his mother, while he's in her womb, was to abstain from
Wine.
right, wine, strong drink, and so forth. And that they were to raise him up, and of course he was to not drink wine or strong drink. And what else was he to not do?
Cut his hair.
Cut his hair, yeah. Now one other little note, just FYI, another aspect of the Nazarite vow, if a person were to take that upon themselves, they were to abstain from anything that would make them unclean, which would include, of course, touching dead bodies. Some scholars, when they read that in chapter 13, that it wasn't specifically mentioned, and then, of course, Samson becomes a warrior, and he's touching some dead bodies here and there, and so forth. But since the angel did not include that in that particular declaration, some Old Testament scholars look at that and look at his situation as a Nazarite as sort of an exception to the rule for what was typically expected of a Nazarite. So what's the distinction between a Nazarite and a Nazarene? Pretty simple one. I just wondered if you'll hear Jesus the Nazarene, right? And sometimes people confuse the two, but they're not the same thing. What is a Nazarene?
Someone from Nazareth.
Right. Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Nazarene, right? So, yeah, Nazarene, Nazarite are not the same thing. Anything else about Samson that you've been thinking about? Anything that since our visit last week that you've kind of been sitting on and given some consideration to, and you thought you'd like to discuss a little bit?
I had a question there that you said not supposed to touch dead bodies, but he was killing the bodies. But
well, no, but there's an instance where he touches a dead body too, and we'll get to that. Yeah, it's not a human body in that instance, but it's a dead body, and which would have been considered ritually unclean. So that for a typical Nazarite, or for a priest, or anybody who had been consecrated to the purposes of God, some of the Levites and some of the things that they were up to and called to do sometimes, they would not be allowed to do what he did there. And touching a dead body was one of those things. So, or actually, even the typical Jew, if you wanted to participate fully in certain aspects of their worship, you had to go through a ceremonial cleansing. And one of the things you would not do during that period, of course, was touch a dead body. Don't do it, And yet, Samson, there is that occasion where, we'll come to that, but there is that occasion where he does that. So, anything else about last week? Anything about the angelic visit? Anything that you've been percolating on mentally? Nancy, I wondered if you might say something because we discussed a little bit after the fact. No. You recall there were a couple of other instances of angelic visitations and so forth. What was the conclusion that we made in the instances in the scriptures where an angelic messenger shows up and says, hey, you're going to have a baby, or something to that effect? What was a conclusion that we made from that? It's usually precipitating something pretty important, right? God is up to something, and God wants them to be prepared. He's building their faith. He's also basically wanting them to be aware how significant this child was and to pay special attention to how they raised them, right? Because it would influence not just the upbringing of that particular child, but generations to follow whose lives were impacted by this child at some point. Moses, Samuel,
Yeah, Sarah.
yeah,
Abraham.
yeah, Sarah and Abraham. We talk about Isaac and so forth, and he's one of the patriarchs, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? Right?
Isn't there something about Sodom and Gomorrah with that too, that the angels, someone.
Yeah, it wasn't about a baby in that instance, but they came and
It was one of the women then.
it was it was to Lot and that it was right before God, and the angels were trying to get Lot and his family out of town.
Right.
Yeah, and they were resisting and
But they did appear to them.
yeah, that's right. And there were some other instances too. I mean, like when before Jericho, of course, an angelic visitor visited Joshua, right? You remember, and kind of talked with him and got him ready for that instance. And we talked about Gideon. Remember, another angelic messenger came and visited Gideon. You called him a mighty warrior of the Lord and so forth. So it's always significant. And one thing we also talked about is the danger of becoming overly fixated on angels also. And, Samson's father, there was a little bit of maybe he was a little too excited by the angel and less excited by the God who sent the angel. And always remember that, the angels are simply messengers. They're messengers. The big deal is that God sent them. And that's the important thing to remember. So when the angel in this particular instance shows up and says, this is what I want you to do with the baby. You're going to raise him up as a Nazirite. Mom, I don't want you to, while he's in your womb, do not drink wine and so forth and so on. And, so you get it, right? Yeah. All right. So we come to the chapter 14. At the end of chapter 13, it doesn't say a whole lot, but a couple of notable things. In verse 24, the woman bore a son, called his name Samson, just like they were told, right? And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. The Lord blessed him. Okay. And first of all, before we read verse 25 in chapter 13, what do you think is meant by the Lord blessed him?
Gave him understanding.
Okay, maybe gave him understanding, and what else?
Peace and understanding.
Peace and understanding, okay, yeah.
Strength.
Gave him strength, right?
He was
Yeah.
a happy fella.
He was a happy fella, right? He was such a happy baby. I don't know how strong he was when he was a baby. Maybe he was lifting the sofa up for Mom while she vacuumed. I don't know. He was a happy baby. Yeah. The main thing that we can just it doesn't explain it. It just says that the Lord blessed him. And what we can assume from that is that the Lord made him successful in the things that he attempted to do. That's usually what the general gist is of it. That God protected him, and and when you're successful, let me ask you this question: what often happens when you're successful? Repeatedly. A person who is successful can turn their back on God. Why?
Because they think they did it on their own instead of the Lord blessed.
They forget how they got there. They forget why they're blessed, right?
They rely on themselves rather than the Lord.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Other things can go with it. Entitlement. You know what I mean when I say that entitlement. When we're blessed, we can just sort of think that the universe revolves around us, and that good things should happen to us. That's the natural order of things. Good things should happen. But is that the case for everybody? No. But it's that is what it is for Samson. Why do you suppose that it's that way for Samson?
He just kind of let it go to his head.
Well,
I mean,
yeah, and I think you're right, Robin, and we're going to come to that and unpack that because that's really important. But why do you think? Why do you think he's blessed in the first place?
God chose to give him to his mom and dad.
Okay, God chose to give him to. Okay, yeah. What else?
He lived as a Nazarite.
Do what?
He lived as a Nazarite to worship the Lord.
Okay, So you think God blessed him because he was a Nazarite?
That was one of the reasons he got blessed him. I don't think that would be the only reason.
Okay. Yeah. Do you think that the blessings were deserved by Samson?
Probably not.
Yeah. It's unclear at this point.
Yeah.
But the point that I'm making is that sometimes it's kind of in our worldly DNA. We like cause and effect things. We like to think that if I do good, God will bless me and make me successful. Right? And if I do wrong, that God will punish me or he'll take away my blessings. Right?
Right?
Is that always the case?
No.
If that were the case, then it wouldn't say in Psalms, don't envy the evildoer.
Right.
Because their humbling will come, right? God will deal with that. So in this case, all we know is that God blessed him. And the only other thing we know about Samson, we don't know if he was a good kid or a bad kid. It doesn't really say. He could have been a sassy kid. He could have been a kid who didn't listen to his parents at all. We don't know. All we know are two things. The first thing is that he was called by God. He was appointed by God for things that are yet to be.
Right.
And the other thing we know is this: God blessed him. We don't know what the causal relationship is. We don't know exactly, except this. We know that God blessed him, and perhaps what we should really conclude from that is that God blessed him to protect him for the purpose for which God called him. There was a reason that Samson is born to them. Right? There's a reason. So whether he's quite as good a kid as he ought to be, whether he's disrespectful or sassy, or maybe he's an angelic little child who, I don't know about that. But we'll see, because later on, I don't know. But we know that God blessed him, and the blessing came because of the calling. Do you see where I'm going with that? Okay. Now, so that's the setup for tonight. Except to say, verse 25, where it says this: the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mollohan, Dan, between Zorah and Ashtaol. Okay. The Lord did what? Stirred him. What do you suppose that means?
Just kind of getting excited.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah, worked up.
excited,
Yeah, worked up for some reason. And some of the things that we will read won't be clear right at first why it is the way that it is until we get further into the reading. And so we have to be patient when we read the scriptures, knowing that some questions we may have may not be answered quite at first, but will be eventually. Okay, so all we know now that not only is he's called, he's blessed, and now he's stirred up. That's all we have for setup. Okay. And, all right, in chapter 14, would somebody like to read verses 1 through 5, or 1 through, let's go a little further, 7.
Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all our people, that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in your eyes. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time the Philistines ruled over Israel. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes.
Okay, there's a lot here I want to talk about real quick. The first one is an expression that's used 2 different times in this reading. Did you catch it? Something something he says, and then something an observation it makes about him.
That she's special in his eyes.
That she's right
Right.
in his eyes. Yeah. That's just such a loaded statement. for a believer. Because they're often, now let me ask you this. Well, let's go through the facts. News story time, right? The who, what, when, where. All right, so who is the who? Who are the who's? We know Samson's one of the who's.
The Philistine.
And
The Philistines are another who. Collectively, they're a who. His parents are a who. And the chick.
Yeah.
The chick who is right in his eyes, right? She's right in my eyes. Back up. I don't know. So, sorry, that was really bad. Okay, so Samson, his parents, the Philistines, and this particular woman, a daughter of the Philistines, and Timnah. So, what's a what here? What's going on? He's apparently more or less grown up, young man, and so at that stage in his life, he's thinking about getting married, right? Okay. And what happens?
He's going against his mother and father's wishes.
And specifically, how?
Went after with Philistine.
Yeah, why is that a big deal?
Because that was God's plan, what he thought, his parents' plan.
Well, hold on, you're getting ahead of us, Robin.
Sorry.
Why are they upset about it? Let me ask it that way. Why is that disagreeable in the eyes of his parents?
But they didn't think they should marry out of the family.
Well, uncircumcised too. Right?
Yeah, if they're not a Jew, they're uncircumcised, which is to say
Not-
that they're not part of the covenant
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
right? There's no buy-in on their part with the things of God and so forth, and so they don't have that mark of that which is a symbol of them being set apart for God. So the Philistines are not their friends, and they're not fellow believers of a different denomination. They are what?
Enemies?
More or less. I think you can use that term here. Yeah. Because of what? Why do you suppose we can call them enemies? It's in verse 4.
They're uncircumcised.
Well, that's a problem, but why are they enemies though? Per se. Because they had Gentile people that technically they weren't enemies with, who other people who were not circumcised, and they weren't necessarily enemies with.
Had dominion over it.
Right, they had dominion, or they ruled over Israel. So here's the setup for typically the judges that we read about in the book of Judges, right? When do they appear? Generally, what's happening that the judges appear? In every other instance.
To guide and keep the Jews faithful to God.
That's part of it, and then the other part is that there's an oppressor. And the judges are raised up by God, and the oppressors are there because they are following idols, right? And they've departed from walking with God. They're not worshiping God. They're worshiping false things, the idols of the people around them. So, there's that. And then when, after a time, and the suffering of God's people increases, God raises up a judge. When the people of God are being oppressed or have someone who has dominion over them, at that point, when the people of God are ready to maybe listen finally, God raises up a judge. So this is how the setup is similar, or basically the same as the other instances where we read about the judges. The judges are tools in the hand of God to deliver them from their oppressors. And we know that's what the case is here because it says in verse 4 and 5, well, verse 4, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. And at that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Okay, so here's the setup. Now, I think we have to look at verse 4 really carefully, too. What is it that the parents don't know is from the Lord?
That the Lord was wanting this to take place.
Right. But see, it isn't just, you're right, you're exactly right, Debbie. So hold on to that. It isn't just that his parents don't want him to marry outside the family or outside their nation. It was actually against God's rules, God's commandment to marry people of other nationalities because of the problem of idolatry. So if you do a shallow reading of this, you might think, well, God put him up to it. God willed him to do evil. Do you see why I'm saying that? Why it looks like we could say that from this reading, if we do a shallow reading here. Now, does God cause us to do evil? Let me submit this to you. That there was an evil in Samson that God handed Samson over to, that God would use to bring about a deliverance for his people. I don't know how else to say that. It's not that God made Samson do this. Samson's responsible for his decisions here. Samson's responsible for his heart's position toward God and for the callousness, the callousness that he has towards the things of God and the casual attitude he has towards his Maker. Samson is responsible. But God knows this condition, this quality in Samson's life. This is why I don't think he was a good kid. Because I think he was probably, we don't have a lot of evidence up to this point, so we have to kind of backtrack, It looks to me like he's selfish. I want to do what's right in my eyes. I don't care about the things of God. Why do I say that? Because he says to his parents, she looks right to me. Doesn't matter what God says.
And get her for it.
Yeah, and he wants them to be complicit.
Please, or can I go down there?
Right. And what does Dad do? Sure. Dad, wouldn't it have been good to take a stand there and instruct your son? I wonder why he didn't do that. Why do you suppose?
Because it was part of God's plan.
This is true.
I mean, God knew.
God allowed this to happen. This is part of God's plan. That's true. But on a more human level, why did the father not address the problem of the son? Wanted to make him happy. You want that new car? Sure. You want that new thing? Yeah, sure. Go ahead, son. Go ahead.
Want the new camel? Okay.
Go ahead. New camel? Yeah. Thank you, Robin. That was perfect. That was great.
Sorry.
No, that was right. You're right. Yeah. That's one of the dangers when you can see something special about yourself. And when a person can discern a calling upon their lives, it becomes potentially a vulnerable place for pride. And with that comes selfishness. With pride comes that idea that the universe revolves around me, and with that comes selfishness. I'm going to feed myself whatever I want. And I don't mean just physical food. I'm talking about any pleasure, anything that gratifies me. The moment I want it, I get it. And we kind of see that play out in his behavior in what he does on the road to Timnah. What does he do there? Wait a minute, I'm getting ahead of myself now, Robin. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and read a little further? In verse 10 through verse 20. Oh, wait a minute, we have to back up because we only read to verse 7, didn't we? Okay, so let's read verse 8 through 9, and then we'll go to 10 and so forth. Verses 8 and 9.
After some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. He took some of them in his hands and went along eating. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them. They also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion.
Okay, so how did that honey get there?
The dead lion.
The dead lion. How did that dead lion get there?
He killed it.
And how did he kill that lion?
Bare hand.
With his bare hands. It says he tore it apart as one tears apart a young goat. I'm thinking, I don't even know what that looks like.
Yeah. Like a piece of
they go around tearing apart young goats? I don't know. It's kind of graphic, but it's so casual about, oh, you know, like you tear apart a young goat. I'm like, okay. So he kills the lion, this lion that comes at him roaring. And it's a great image because it shows, in some ways, it's sort of predictive of the kind of calling that he has. You know, Satan rises up against him, comes roaring after him, and what does he do with this lion? He does, yeah, he takes care of business. You know, without being too descriptive, he takes care of business. And he goes down and he's talking to the girl who's right in his eyes. And after a little while, he returns to take her. He turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. Why do you suppose he did that?
Probably to see if it's still there, and there were any more there.
Any more lions to tear apart? Oh, I'm just in the mood to tear apart some lions today. Yeah, or maybe a bear. I'll do a bear, yeah.
Yeah?
Maybe to kind of relish the experience. Maybe to kind of, you know, think about how great he is.
Yeah.
Look what I did. I took care of that lion. And he gets there, and inside the lion, bees have swarmed and been there just long enough, apparently, to build some honey there, right? So he scrapes up the honey and he takes it to mom and dad and says, hey, and I guess they eat it. They don't know where it came from. It's honey from Timnah. They do good honey. Okay, so in verse 10, one other thing I wanted to say about the honey also. This reinforces potentially a couple of things for Samson. The first, of course, is that I'm so great, you know, that. And then secondly, the world is my oyster. You know, this honey, wow, you know, I earned it, you know, and I can just have any sweet thing in life, any sweet experience, any sweet moment or pleasure I want. And his circumstances seem to support that idea. We tend to make judgments about life and about spiritual things based on what we experience. And so far, his experience has been, I'm all that, the world is my oyster, and I can take anything I want.
Like a teenager.
Yeah, and he probably literally is a teenager. Or, you know, I mean, an older teen possibly, but still, he's young. Yeah.
So, would that have been considered unclean?
Right. The lion, which goes back to I mean, I didn't want to make that big a deal of it, but at the same time,
But
it's a dead thing. Yeah.
And
And,
he gives it to his parents, and they don't know it's unclean, and
and that's a good point.
You can't pass that along.
If technically he's doing something that really would be frowned upon by the law. You know, if he's touching a dead thing, he's taking and you know, this isn't, you know, it would not be considered kosher honey. So he takes his non-kosher honey, gives it to his parents, and they participate without knowing it, without realizing it. They become partakers in something he should not have done.
Wouldn't that be an increase in his disobedience to give it to his mom and dad? In the Lord's eyes, wouldn't that increase his disobedience?
If we're to read the touching of the dead lion as a thing he shouldn't have done, which if you're a very traditional Jew, you would have said, don't do that, Samson. I mean, I don't know, as Gentiles, we would think that much of it. You know, we're not under the law anyway, but technically we might go, if we were Jews, especially very conservative Jews, say, oh no, you can't do that. You're unclean, Samson. And we'd say to the parents who partook of the honey too, you're unclean also. You know, you're not qualified. You have to go through the ritual cleansing. You have to give the appropriate sacrifices and wait a certain amount of time, and before you can even go into the tabernacle again, which is before the temple. So it makes it increases in a sense his disobedience, but I think probably would have been a good idea if they asked questions. It doesn't seem like they asked questions. You know, I think they failed parenting 101 on a couple of levels here.
But you would think
Yeah, in any case, they don't ask, so they don't know, they're ignorant, you know.
Right. And it doesn't make it right, but I'm just saying,
Yeah, but it wouldn't have been their sin.
well, they would know.
Well,
They
that,
would know.
it depends, you know. If it's a willful choice to not ask questions, I don't even ask anymore. If it's a willful choice not to ask questions, then yes, it is their sin.
Or maybe they're at the point they ought to know him well enough to know.
Maybe he's such a troublemaker, they would say, okay, let's just eat it.
Or they could have, yeah, they could have done that, they could have done that. I didn't know we'd have so much fun with this honey thing. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, it is. There's just a lot of nuances, and we know that
Would they consider an animal to be, I guess a dead animal. But I mean, that would be my first thought. I know he's not supposed to touch dead humans.
well, no. Do you know why in Jesus' day they would cover their wine goblets with a cloth? And the purpose of that cloth was to filter wine that they poured into it.
Right,
And what they were filtering out were dead gnats.
right, that makes sense.
Because if they drank it, if they were, Jesus would he pointed out that you're getting fixated in too many, in all the wrong things. You're carrying the legalism too far. But he talked about you strain out a gnat, but you do what?
Okay.
You strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. Now they weren't literally swallowing camels.
Right, but still.
They were breaking the law sort of in a way that was almost impossible not to, but still, and this little thing, they were so fixated on it that they were overlooking the huge. Now he wasn't saying they weren't breaking the law,
Right.
but he was just saying that you're really missing the big picture here. You're really breaking the law in your general attitude towards God, towards other people, and your hypocrisy makes God sick. So that's how they swallowed the camel. Okay, so yeah, touching the dead lion would have been unclean if we were really strict on it. But Samson didn't seem to think rules applied to him. So,
No, he didn't. And then his parents didn't.
yeah, and there were only two rules that we probably can feel fairly confident that he kept. The first one, of course, is that he didn't what?
Cut his hair.
Cut his hair. Right. And the second one was that he didn't drink alcohol. Even though he's in some party situations, some have assumed that he has, but at the same time, it doesn't explicitly say that he has. So, because it doesn't say that he did, I'm inclined to think that he just watched them all drink around him, and then, and he didn't. But anyway.
But he would have been really limited on what he could drink. Because they drank a lot of wine because the water was nasty, right?
He can drink water.
I'm saying.
No, he could drink water. I mean, that's...
Well, I would want to drink water probably. But
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
yeah.
You might see
He just wants to drink fresh water. Yeah,
You
don't
might
drink...
always see creepy crawly things in your water.
Yeah,
Or worms or
yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
And I thought my alluding to tearing the goats apart was going to be bad. Thank you, Ron. Okay. Now we're drinking creepy crawly things. So, no.
That would be my thought. I wouldn't want creepy
No, I wouldn't
crawly
either.
things in my water.
So we filter it out, right? Okay.
I mean,
We're full
you're
circle now.
water too.
So in verse 10, so after the lion, he took the honey back to his parents and so forth. Verse 10 is, somebody, if you would read verses 10 through 14.
When Samson's father accompanied him to Timnah for the marriage, Samson hosted a party there, for this was customary for bridegrooms to do. When the Philistines saw he had no attendants, they gave him 30 groomsmen who kept him company. Samson said to them, I will give you a riddle. If you really can solve it during the 7 days the party lasts, I will give you 30 linen robes and 30 sets of clothes. But if you cannot solve it, you will give me 30 linen robes and 30 sets of clothes. They said to him, let us hear your riddle. He said to them, out of the one who eats came something to eat, out of the strong one came something sweet. They could not solve the riddle for 3 days.
Okay. So, what's the who and Samson, obviously, and who are the other who's? Is all the who's down in Whoville?
The 30 Philistines.
Yeah, the Philistines, and in particular the 30 companions that they send in, to basically honor the marriage celebration. And so Samson gives them a riddle. What's this all about?
The lion and the honey.
Yeah, it is. Why is he doing this?
Make him think he's,
To make him what?
maybe think he's really strong or whatever.
Strong, maybe? Okay.
The lion.
Yeah.
Yeah, he killed the lion with his bare hand.
Yeah, now he hasn't told them that. He's just giving them the riddle.
It didn't say that he's really.
You're thinking he's setting it up.
He's alluding to
Okay.
it. He's alluding to it.
Yeah.
He gives him the riddle so that he could gain the 30 outfits for himself.
Yeah, I mean, so this is not a riddle that they can solve without help, right?
Right.
It's not like you think of a really, if you're paying attention, you're clever. You have to know something specific to be able to answer this riddle. You'd have to know that Samson did what he did with the lion, and that what happened after the fact was that there was honey, right? You'd have to know that. There's no way you could guess what he's talking about otherwise. What? Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. I have no idea what he's talking about. So naturally, after 3 days, they can't solve it. And on the fourth day, now, he has, they make a bet. What's the bet? If they can't solve it, then,
They gotta give him 30 outfits.
which would put him out kind of, give him a sweet deal, right? No pun intended. And if he loses, relatively speaking, he loses big time, right?
Right.
He's got to give them new clothes.
30.
Yeah. So on the fourth day, verse 15, it goes on to tell us what happened. And let's just read it through the end of the chapter.
And it came to pass on the seventh day that they said unto Samson's wife, entice the husband, and he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we burn thee and thy father's house with fire. Have ye called us to take that we have? Is it not so? And Samson's wife swept before him and said, Thou doest but hate me, and love me not. Thou hast put forth a riddle unto the children of my people, and hast not told it me. And he said unto her, Behold, I have not told it my father, nor my mother, and shall I tell it thee? And she swept before him the 7 days, while their feast lusted. And it came to pass on the seventh day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him, and she told the riddle to the children of her people. And the men of the city said unto him on the seventh day, before the sun went down, What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said unto them, If ye have not plowed with my heifer, ye had not found out my riddle. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon, and slay 30 men of them, and took their spoil, and gave change of garments unto them which expounded the riddle. And his anger was kindled, and he went up to his father's house. But Samson's wife was given to his compassion, whom he had used as his friend.
Right, or basically his best man, yeah. So he asks his riddle. On the fourth day of the 7 days, of course, on the fourth day, they get panicky. They don't know how to solve it. They don't want to lose the bet. They look down on him, and why would they look down on him?
Because he's a Jew.
He's a Jew, yeah. So they're Philistines, and he's an Israelite. And because the Philistines were the oppressors, they were the conquerors of the Israelites at this particular time, the way that it was interpreted was that they were a superior people to the Israelites. So here's a lowly, dirty Jew, from their perspective. Obviously, that's not our perspective, but that's how they would have looked at it. And they, looking down on him, They don't want to lose this bet for two reasons. One, they don't want to look bad and disgraced. And then secondly, they don't want to have to ante up. No, that's not the right word. What's the right word? Ante up is when you put it up for a bet, but they don't want to pay up. Yeah, pay up. Okay. Yeah, thank you. I thought I was butchering something there, but you know what I mean. So, so they do what? They panic. They do what? They go to his wife, right? Because she's one of them, right? Yeah. And what do?
Right, her and her family.
They threaten her and her family. They threaten to kill her. And so she goes to Samson. She doesn't say this, they're threatening me. She doesn't tell him that they're threatening my family. She kind of jumps into the deceit, right? How does she do that?
You didn't even tell me.
Right. She weeps. I guess makes a big show of it. And she presses him hard. I forget how it said it, Janice, in what you read, how it, something to the effect that she just wore him down in verse 17.
And she wept before him the 7 days, while their feast lasted. And it came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him.
Lay sore. That was the expression. Yeah. Yeah. Pressed him hard. And yeah. Just kept pushing. She nagged. Yeah. Yeah. And he gives in. Now, first he says, I haven't told my parents, how am I going to tell you? But eventually he tells her. And then it says that she told her people. And then they tell him the answer, they win the bet, and he honors the bet. How does he honor the bet?
He goes and kills.
He goes into the town, and he kills 30 people, takes their clothes, and gives them. And I'm sure the people of the town were not particularly pleased with that. So all of this is stirring up the Philistines. They're really hating him. And of course, he's not coming out looking shiny either. He's, and we'll go into more of that we'll get into more of that as we go further in the next study. But this is part of that situation by which God is going to deliver his people. Now, here's kind of the point. Samson is an unworthy vessel. We see it clearly in his character. So God's deliverance doesn't hinge on Samson's complete obedience. Now, there are instances when an act of disobedience affected the people, but God knows Samson up front, and God's using his own character flaws to bring about a good thing.
Right. Make his plan.
Now, he's not going to reward Samson for being a jerk,
No.
or for being selfish, or for being proud, he's not going to reward him, but he's going to use him. And I think about that. I think about, God, he invites you and I to trust him and walk in obedience. And when we do, we have the rewards of fellowship with God. And we have also the promise of God's regard later in the eternal rewards. There are some eternal rewards. I don't like the idea of us counting our heavenly crown jewels or anything like that. I don't think that's exactly what is meant by that. But still, there are rewards for those who walk with God and trust him and so forth. And for those who do not walk with God or choose to not walk with God or not cooperate with God, they can't knock God or his purposes off track. They can't knock the purposes of God off track. Samson's an unworthy vessel, but God uses him in spite of those character flaws. Now, would Samson have, if his heart had been seeking the Lord, could God have used him? Of course.
Yeah.
If his heart had been seeking the Lord, would he have then probably enjoyed what God was doing in his life more than he did? I mean, we know where this is going. We know things about Samson that we haven't yet read about, right? Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure that he would have enjoyed fellowship with God if his eyes had not been on himself as they were, but on God. And remember, the fundamental problem for the people of God all along is this, that they take their eyes off of God and put them someplace else.
And there's so many of us that forget that we all start out as sinners.
That's right.
We're all sinners in the beginning.
Yeah.
What's our plan, what's God got planned for us?
Yep.
In the future when we do decide to come to Him.
Right.
I think that's when we find where our so-called stones will be.
Yeah.
I think it also, it shows us we don't have to be God doesn't expect us to be.
He doesn't expect us to be perfect, and we're not going to be.
What our faults are.
Yeah, he is.
What our good
Now,
faults are, what our bad
We
faults
know, of course, as we read further, we'll get into this more in detail, but just to kind of look forward to it, we'll talk about this at length, is that Samson, he does a lot of things, and God uses him, and at the same time, he does a lot of dumb things, and in spite of that, God doesn't forget him. He doesn't ultimately disqualify himself from using, but he gets humbled. We know this, right? And then God uses him again, powerfully. So, yeah, things to think about as we continue with the life and the ministry, if you can call it that, of Samson. All right. Any final thoughts? We're going to stop there with the end of chapter 14. What was Samson's mood as he honored his bet? The what? Oh, yeah. Hot anger. He's got hot anger. So he's acting impulsively, isn't he? Rashly. Yeah, so another thing we can probably conclude about Samson, this gives us a clue about his general character, and that is he's explosive and filled with rage at times, apparently. So, got a hot temper, yeah. All right. Any other thoughts? All right. Would somebody like to close us in prayer?
Precious Heavenly Father, we come to Thee, Lord, just thank You, Lord, for this lesson tonight that we received, Lord, and we pray that You keep a mighty hand on each and every one as we go our separate ways until we return again. In Your precious name we pray.
Amen. All right. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy our time together.